Arizona Territory, May of 1879. The desert wind carried the smell of ash long after the fire had died. Perrin Maeve stood barefoot in the red dirt, her wedding dress blackened and torn, the hem stiff with soot. Her veil had burned away hours ago. Her left arm, wrapped in a strip of linen she tore from the petticoat, throbbed with every heartbeat. She had not looked at the wound since the fire. She did not need to. The skin felt tight, raw. Her once straw-colored hair clung in sweaty patches to her face, streaked with soot and blood. She had no horse, no water. Just the scorched dress and the sound of her own breath as she walked east. Alone. The fire had started at midnight. Her father's ranch, meant to be her home now that she had married into the Barrett family, had gone up in a blaze so fast Perrin barely made it out. She remembered the screams. Not hers. Her groom. His brother's. Someone laughing. Then gunshots. Then fire. No one had come after her. No one left to come. She walked until her legs gave out beneath a mesquite tree, and she stayed there until the sun rose again. The wound blistered. Her lips cracked. A buzzard circled overhead. She did not cry. She had done all her crying in the flames. By the third day, Perrin lost count of time. She stumbled through the desert like a ghost, her dress dragging behind her like a funeral shroud. Then she saw him. He was on horseback, alone, a rifle slung across his back and a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. He slowed his horse the second he saw her, boots nudging the mare to a quiet halt. She tensed every muscle ready to run even though she could barely stand. He dismounted without a word. Cautious but not afraid. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low and steady. She didn't answer. He stepped closer, hands up, not touching her. "You need water?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She nodded. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a canteen and held it out. Not forced, just offered. She took it with shaking hands. The water hit her throat like lightning. She drank too fast and gasped, coughing, but she held on. He watched her carefully. "Name's Thayer Fitch." She held the canteen against her chest. "Perrin. You alone?" She nodded. He glanced over her, the scorched dress, the wrapped arm. His jaw tightened, but he didn't ask questions. "Come on," he said, reaching for her hand. "There's a camp not far. Shade. Supplies." She stared at his hand. It was rough, scarred, but steady. She took it. He led her to his horse, helped her onto the saddle, and walked beside her as they moved through the desert. They did not talk much that day. He set up camp near a bend in dry rock where the wind died down at night. He built a small fire, boiled beans, and offered her bread from his bag. She ate slowly. Her hands trembled. That night, when she tried to sleep, the firelight flickering across her skin reminded her of the wedding blaze. She sat up fast, chest heaving. Thayer was on the other side of the fire, sharpening his knife. He looked up. "You all right?" She shook her head, eyes wide. He stood and walked over, kneeling beside her. "Not gonna let anything hurt you. Not out here." She looked at him, studied his face for any sign of a lie. There was none, just quiet certainty. He pulled a blanket from his bag and wrapped it around her shoulders, careful not to touch her burned arm. "You sleep. I'll keep watch." "Why?" His eyes met hers. "Because someone should've." The next morning he cleaned her wound. She tried to pull away, but he held her steady, gentle but firm. The skin was blistered along her forearm, the edges red and raw. "Looks worse than it is," he muttered. "You're lucky it didn't catch deeper." "Doesn't feel lucky?" He glanced at her, then back to his work. "No, I reckon it doesn't." His hands were sure, his touch never lingering. The bandage was clean, the salve cool. She bit her lip and looked away. She stayed with him that day. And the next. He never pried. Never asked what happened at the ranch. But she caught him watching her sometimes, eyes dark with something like sorrow, or anger, maybe both. They headed for Bisbee, where he said he knew someone who could look at her arm proper. Along the trail they saw no one, just desert, wind, and the long silence between them. One night, she asked, "Why are you out here alone?" He poked at the fire. Used to ride with a scout team. Patchy territory. Got tired of killing. You a soldier? Not anymore. She studied him. You always help strangers lost in the desert? No, he looked at her. But you weren't just lost. The fire crackled between them. She lay back on the blanket. Thank you. He nodded. The next morning, as they rode, her voice broke the quiet. You saved my life. He looked over. I just gave you water. No, she said, voice low. You saw me, and you didn't leave. He looked at her, then really looked, and something shifted between them. They reached a trading post on the edge of Bisbee by midday. A woman healer there rewrapped Perrin's arm, murmured about infection, and handed her a salve that stung but eased the pain. Thayer paid for it all without a word. They stayed in a small cabin just beyond town, a place Thayer said was safe, left to him by a friend who had passed. 2 rooms. A porch. Quiet. That night, Perrin stood in the doorway watching the stars. Thayer came up beside her. You thinking about going back? I have nothing to go back to. He nodded. She turned to him. You saved me. I just know, she said, stepping closer. You did. He watched her carefully. You are not broken, Perrin. I have scars. So do I. He reached for her hand, slow, giving her time to pull away. She did not. His fingers brushed hers, then curled around them. She looked at him, at the man who found her in the heat and dust, who never looked away from the damage. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him. He froze for half a second, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her back, slow and deep, like he had been waiting for that moment since the first time he saw her. When they pulled apart, his hands stayed at her waist, hers at his chest. Stay, he said. She nodded. I want to. And she meant it. The porch boards creaked beneath Perrin's bare feet as she stepped out under the morning sun. The air smelled of pine and dry clay, clean in a way that made her chest ache. A cluster of mule deer moved along the far ridge, too distant to startle. She leaned against the rail, cradling a cup of warm coffee Thayer had poured before heading to the shed out back. She hadn't asked what he did out there. He rose before light, came in with sawdust on his sleeves and sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He moved with purpose, not restlessness. It comforted her, that quiet rhythm. When the door opened behind her, she didn't turn. Thayer's voice came low, close. I wired a man in Morenci. He's got a lead on who might have ridden through that night. Her fingers tightened around the tin cup. You didn't have to do that. I know. She turned to face him. He stood with his hands braced on either hip, the brim of his hat casting a line of shadow over his jaw. What did he say? 3 riders bought kerosene and fresh rounds, headed south toward the border. No names. Just descriptions. He hesitated. One had a burn scar down his jaw. Said he was grinning the whole time. That's him, she said, voice flat. Thayer didn't press. He never did. Instead, he reached for the cup in her hands and took it gently. There's a trail behind the ridge. You feel up to walking? She nodded. They didn't speak as they climbed, her steps still stiff from the wound, but steadier now. He offered a hand when the incline grew steep. She took it without flinching. At the top, the land opened wide, all ochre hills and dry blue sky. A falcon dipped low, wings slicing the air. Thayer pointed across the valley. Used to be copper in those hills. Company men stripped it out by 75. Now it's just dust and snakes. She followed the shape of his gesture. It's still beautiful. You see it different after loss, he said. Like everything's trying to keep breathing. They sat on a flat patch of stone, heat rising beneath them. She watched his hands as he rolled up his sleeves, long fingers calloused and nicked from blade work and rope. You ever lose someone? She asked. My brother, he said. Mescal Springs. He rode out alone, tried to stop a cattle theft. They left him face down in the arroyo. She looked at him and something quiet passed between them, not shared pain, but understanding of the space grief took up, how it changed the shape of every room. I'm sorry, she said. Was a long time ago? But I remember the sound of the dirt hitting the coffin. She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for his hand. He let her. Back at the cabin, the light had shifted golden. She helped slice turnips, her hands steadier with the knife than it had been days before. Thayer worked beside her, chopping salt pork, the rhythm of their blades filling the space between them. As they ate, she asked, "What will you do once I'm healed?" His brow furrowed slightly. "Hadn't thought about it. You. I don't know who I am without them," she said. "But I'd like to find out somewhere quiet." He nodded. "You could stay." She looked at him, not startled, but searching. "Why?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She pushed her plate aside. "I don't want to be something you feel sorry for." "You aren't. Then what am I to you?" His voice dropped low, roughened by something he hadn't said aloud until now. "You're the woman who lived through hell and kept walking. You're the one who looked me in the eye and didn't flinch." She stood slowly, walked to where he sat, and reached for his face. He didn't move. Her fingers traced the curve of his cheek, where sun and wind had left their mark. "You never asked for anything." "I didn't want to take what wasn't given." She leaned in. Their lips met again, not desperate, but certain. Later, she lay with her head on his chest, the fire burning low. His heartbeat thudded steady beneath her ear. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Not because I'm lost. Because I'm choosing to." His arm curled around her, holding her close without pulling her in. "You're not the burned bride anymore," he said. "You're just Perrin. And you're mine if you want to be." She smiled into his shirt. "I do." Late June brought heat that settled into the bones of the land and didn't lift come nightfall. The boards of the cabin porch warmed Perrin's back as she knelt with a damp cloth, scrubbing dust from the sole of her only remaining boot. The leather had cracked near the toe, but it held. Her fingers moved with quiet focus, the same way they had moved across her mother's sewing table years ago, before fire took what it had no right to. Thayer's voice came from the fence line. Mule slipped through again. "I'll fix the post today." Perrin looked up. "You want help?" He shook his head as he crossed the yard, wiping his brow with the edge of his shirt sleeve. "Not unless you've taken up post hole diggin' for pleasure." She smiled, faint but real. "I'll leave the fun to you." He crouched beside her, sweat glistening along his jaw. "That boot's past saving. I've walked farther in worse." "I know. Still, I got a pair of women's riding boots at the trading post last time. Thought they might suit." "You bought boots for a woman you didn't know was staying?" He met her eyes without hesitation. "I figured hoping wasn't the same as assuming." She reached for his hand. "They'll fit." Later, while he worked the fence, Perrin sat inside with scraps of muslin and a needle she'd found in the cabin's drawer. She stitched slowly, the thread pulled taut between her fingers, her stitches uneven at first, then steadier. By the time the light shifted golden through the window pane, she'd fashioned a kerchief in simple blue and gray, the kind a man might tie around his neck for the trail. When Thayer came in for supper, she handed it to him. He turned it over in his hands. "You made this. Seemed fair. You've given me more than I can name." He folded the cloth carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "You giving me something don't mean you owe me." "I know," she said. "But I wanted to." They ate in companionable quiet, the scrape of fork against tin the only sound for a long while. When the sun dropped low, Thayer leaned back in his chair. "You ever think about leaving Arizona?" She glanced up. "Why?" "Not running," he said. "Just choosing. I don't know what's west of here." "Pine forests," he said. "Cooler air. More shade. There's a town up near Prescott where a man can build without being asked what side he fought on." "You're thinking of starting over." "I'm thinking of building something new. Not running from what came before, but not letting it decide everything after." She folded her hands in her lap. "And if I came with you?" His voice was low. "I'd be grateful every day you did." That night, she stood at the wash basin brushing out her hair. The strands fell past her shoulders, light catching on the places fire hadn't touched. Thayer watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You thinking on it?" he asked. She set the brush down. "I've thought of little else." "You scared?" She looked at him in the mirror. "Not of leaving, just of taking a step that don't come with a way back." "There's no going back, Perrin. But there's forward. With me if you want it." She turned, bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "Then yes, I want it." He crossed the room and held her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheeks. You sure? I've never been more. He kissed her again, slower this time, not out of relief or need, but reverence. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Prescott's got a blacksmith who rents out tools, he said. We could build a house. Make it ours. She nodded against him. We make it together. By the end of the week, they'd packed what little they owned into Thayer's wagon. The boots fit her fine. The road ahead stretched long and sunlit. They rode out at dawn, side by side, the desert behind them and the promise of pine ahead. Neither looked back. There was no need. What mattered rode with them. They reached the edge of the Prescott Basin in early July, the wagon wheels creaking as they climbed into country thick with ponderosa and granite. The air smelled of resin and creek water, cooler than anything they'd known in the southern desert. Perrin sat beside Thayer on the bench seat when tugging at the loose strands of her hair. Her arm had healed enough to carry her own weight, though the skin still pulled if she moved too fast. She didn't complain. He didn't ask. The land they settled on belonged to no one. Thayer had spoken with the land agent in town, paid in coin and labor promises, and secured a claim tucked between two ridges. There was already a rough foundation of stone from a miner's cabin long abandoned, and beside it, the remains of a collapsed lean-to. They cleared it together, working through the days with tools borrowed from a smith who asked no questions and took payment in hidework. Perrin kept her hands busy. She learned to mix clay from the riverbank with straw and ash, pressing it into gaps between the stones. Thayer taught her how to notch timber crossbeams, his voice patient, his hands guiding only when she asked. Their silences were no longer heavy. They filled the hours with shared effort, not words. One morning, as mist curled low in the pines, she found him standing by the edge of the clearing, staring toward the north slope. What is it? She asked, brushing dust from her skirt. He didn't turn. There's a spring back that way. I saw it when I rode out early. Water's clean. Cold, too. She stepped beside him. You thinking of digging a trench? Better. I'm thinking we build a catch basin. Enough to keep a garden going. She tilted her head. You want to plant? He looked at her, then eyes steady. I want to feed what's mine. She nodded. Then I'll plant with you. Work gave way to routine. They rose before the sun crested the ridge, ate bread and coffee by the fire, and spent the days raising walls. The roof came last, split shingles stacked one by one, hammered into place while thunderclouds gathered on the far horizon. The first hard rain hit 2 nights later. They sat inside, the roof holding firm above them, and watched water stream down the slope outside. Perrin folded wool blankets beneath the window gaps, catching stray leaks. Thayer passed her a tin bowl of stew, the scent of onion and venison rising with the steam. You still see it? The fire. She didn't answer right away. Not the flames. Just the way the air felt. Thick. Like breathing through cotton. He nodded. I see my brother most nights. Not his face. Just the place where he should have been. She looked at him across the narrow table. Does it ever stop feeling like it's waiting for you? The past, I mean. His voice was quiet. No. But it don't get to steer. She reached across the table and touched his wrist. Tell me something about before. Something small. He tilted his head. Before the war? Before everything fell apart. He thought for a moment. When I was 13, I tried to break a Mustang with a rope and a bad plan. Horse kicked me so hard I couldn't walk straight for a week. My mother laughed so hard she cried. Perrin smiled. She sounds like someone I'd have liked. She was. Perrin leaned her chin into her hand. When I was a girl, I used to hide in the hayloft with a book and a jar of dried cherries. Everyone thought I was out feeding chickens. Good hiding spot. Too good. They once spent an hour looking before someone checked the loft. He reached for her hand then, folding his fingers over hers. You don't have to keep running from what you lost. I'm not, she said. I'm just learning how to carry it without letting it break me. They didn't speak again that night, but when the rain slowed and the fire burned low, he pulled her close in the dark. Her head rested beneath his chin, his hand at the small of her back. By late August, the roof was sealed, the door hung, and the hearthstones laid. The house didn't look like much from the outside, raw timber and rough-cut windows, but inside, it held warmth. It held them. One afternoon, she stood by the garden bed they'd cleared, pressing seeds into the soil. Her hands were stained, her dress damp at the hem, and when Thayer came up behind her, she didn't turn. He wrapped his arms around her waist, chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "This feels like living," she nodded. "It does. I want to marry you." She didn't move. "You already have me. I want it real. Legal. In town. With a record that says you're mine and I'm yours." She turned in his arms. "You sure? I've never been more." Her smile was slow, quiet. "Then let's do it." They rode into Prescott on a clear morning, the courthouse clerk a thin man with ink-smudged cuffs and a wedding ledger bound in leather. No rings. No guests. Just signatures and a solemn promise spoken low between them. "Perrin Maeve Fitch," she said aloud afterward, testing the sound. Thayer kissed her temple. "That's your name, and no one can burn it away." That evening they returned to their home. The sky turned amber behind the pines. She stepped inside first, fingers brushing the lintel as she passed beneath it. He followed, closing the door behind them. They had survived the fire, the desert, the ache of what was lost. What remained was theirs, earned, quiet, and whole. The first frost came early that year, brushing the tops of the pine trees in white and sealing the soil hard beneath Perrin's boots. She stood at the edge of the garden bed, now cleared and blanketed in straw, her breath rising in small clouds as the sun crept over the eastern ridge. The quiet didn't press on her anymore. It held. Thayer came up from the creek trail with 2 hairs hanging from his belt, his coat lined with moleskin she'd sewn in over the last few weeks. He gave a short nod as he passed, the way he always did when his hands were full, and she followed him back to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Inside, the cabin held the scent of juniper smoke and drying apples. The hearth snapped with flames. She bent to stir the ashes, then added another split log from the pile stacked neatly along the wall. They hadn't spoken much that morning, but it wasn't silence from distance. Some days were like just the rhythm of shared tasks, the warmth of knowing the other was near. Thayer skinned the hairs at the table, his knife working slow and neat. Perrin laid out flour and lard, the chilled dough already resting under cloth. As she rolled it smooth with a glass bottle, she glanced his way. "You ever hunted elk?" He looked up, surprised. "Not since I was with the scouts." "Why?" "Been watching the trail. Something big's been bedding near the ridge. Thought it might be worth trying." He grinned, faint and pleased. "You want to go with me?" "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." They left the next morning, just after first light. She wore his old riding coat, cinched at the waist, her rifle slung across her back. The snow barely held, patchy and refrozen, the kind that made each step a calculation. They didn't speak until they reached a narrow slope above a dry creek. A fresh track curved into the brush. Perrin knelt beside it. "Bull, maybe 5 years." "He's heavy." Thayer crouched beside her. "You read tracks better than some men I knew in the war." She didn't look up. "I watched more than I spoke, even as a child." They followed the trail for over an hour, moving quiet and low. When they finally spotted the elk, it was grazing in a clearing, ears twitching at every shift of wind. Thayer raised his rifle, paused, then lowered it again. "You want the shot?" Perrin nodded, took the rifle slow and steady. She sighted, exhaled, and fired. The bull dropped clean, its legs folding beneath it. When she turned to Thayer, he was watching her with something deep and quiet in his gaze. "You don't hesitate. Only when it matters." They dressed the elk together, worked fast as the temperature dipped. By dusk, they'd hauled half the meat back by sled and hung the rest in the smokehouse. Thayer lit the lantern as she washed her hands in the basin, the blood cold against her skin. "I've been thinking," he said, drying his hands on a rag. She looked up, waiting. "There's a parcel south of here, sits lower in the valley, good grazing land. I could run a few head, maybe even trade with the fort come spring." "Sounds like you've already decided." "Not without you." She dried her arms, then crossed the room to him. "I can handle a herd." He touched the side of her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You'd do more than handle it. You'd run it better than most men." "You're not asking me to follow." "No," he said. I'm asking you to build it with me. Then yes. They spent the winter clearing brush and cutting fence posts. When snow made the trail impassable, they read aloud by the hearth, her voice soft over the worn pages of a borrowed almanac. He carved a rocking chair for her from pine, shaped by hand, and she embroidered a cushion from leftover scraps of muslin and wool, each stitch precise and even. One morning in early March, she leaned on the porch rail and watched the slope below where 3 deer grazed in the pale light. Thayer stepped beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "You think it's time?" she asked. He nodded. "We've got enough saved. I'll ride to town tomorrow. Buy 2 heifers and a bull calf. I'll make sure the gate's ready." They moved the bed to the new room that spring after Thayer added a second wall to the cabin. The door frame still stuck when the air turned wet, but it held. Perrin lined the shelves with dried mint and wild sage and painted the window trim with ash-based whitewash. That summer, the heifers dropped calves. The fencing held and the grass came in thick. She planted squash and corn in the new plot, and Thayer built a windbreak from cedar branches hauled down from the ridge. One early evening, as dusk settled low and the crickets began their song, she found him sitting on the porch with his boots off, a tin cup in his hand, watching the last light paint the sky's soft amber. "This is what I wanted," she said, easing down beside him. "What part?" "All of it." He turned toward her, his hand resting at the nape of her neck. "You still carry it, don't you?" "The fire." "Less," she said. "It's softer now. Not gone. But it doesn't burn me anymore. You ever wish you'd taken a different trail?" She shook her head. "Every step led me here." They sat until the stars came out, the land settling into night around them. Years passed slow and full. They built a barn, traded for a mule, and wintered through hard storms and dry summers. They never left their valley. They never had to. What they'd built was enough. He still rose early to mend fence lines. She still baked before noon and read in the quiet hours of afternoon. They grew old with the land and with each other. One morning, as the sun climbed over the ridge, Perrin stepped outside and saw Thayer in the field. Turning toward her with that same quiet look he'd given her the day she first put her hand in his. She walked toward him, her steps sure, her heart steady. He met her halfway, always had, always would, and neither of them ever walked alone again.